Slog FPV, wishing everybody a happy new year, and I hope everyone's holidays have been good so far. Emax has been very prolific this year with the Tiny-Hawk 2 series. An example of that is the Tiny-Hawk 2 Freestyle, which I really like. So when they came out with the Nanohawk, I was very excited about that. So I picked one up and have been flying it for a couple weeks now, and I really like it. There are some things that I think could have been executed a little better as far as out-of-box experience, but it's just minor niggles, and we'll go over the tips that I think that you should potentially do as far as configuration item changes. But I think this quad is definitely very innovative, and we'll go through why this isn't really a whoop, and things that I did to make it fly a little better. So with that, let's go ahead and start the review. So in the box, you get the battery charger. You get some battery adapter cables here, because the battery that you get is the 300 milliamp hour battery that's in a different form factor with a different connector. You can see this is the new GMB connector. So you need the adapter for the PH 2.0 connectors. You get 4 spare props, you get a set of stickers, you get a spare parts bag including a screwdriver, has some extra screws, it has a rubber grommet for the flight controller, it has 2 spare rubber bands to hold the battery in place, and then you get the quad itself. I'm noticing that the frame itself is very squishy. It's so we'll see how well that holds up. And then you get a QR code for the manual to download. So let's quickly go through the specs. The wheelbase is 65 millimeters. The motors are the Emax branded 08, 02, 19,000 kV motors. The camera is the Runcam Nano 3. The all-in-one flight controller is the it's an F4 Maytech F11 flight controller. The receiver is SPI receiver, and it is compatible, the one I have, with D8 and D16. The 4-in-1 ESC is rated at 5 amps, and the VTX back here is 25 milliwatts, and it supports smart audio. And they're recommending, of course, the battery that came with this is the 1S 300 milliamp hour battery. It's a different shape than a typical one, and of course it has the new GNB 27 connector on here. As far as the frame itself, it's not really a ducted whoop frame. If you look at a more traditional one, I'll bring over, here's the Happy model, you can see that it's an actual duct, not a prop guard. And you know, the whoops started out with brushed motors, which aren't as powerful as a brushless motor, and so they really needed the extra efficiency that a duct will provide. You can kind of see that for a traditional whoop, the ducts are a lot higher, and then plus there's this curvature here that will provide a little more efficiency as far as thrust efficiency. Of course, there's some, you know, penalties with that, and that is, you know, it does act kind of like a sail, and you can cause a little instabilities and dives. Of course, everybody talks about yaw washout. So there's trade-offs there. This is not a duct, it's a prop guard. Another big difference is it has this carbon fiber frame. So I wouldn't really consider this a whoop. So as far as weight, I'm measuring 20 grams. Let's compare it to the Mobula 6, which 19-20 grams, so very equivalent in weight. With the recommended 300 milliamp hour battery here. All up weight is 29 grams, so very lightweight unit. So what I changed from the factory settings, starting out with enabling a D-shot beacon, they did in the modes have it set up for beeping when you had the aux channel set, but they didn't have it enabled here in the configuration page or tab. So I went ahead and enabled that. Now granted, it's not going to be very loud for you to hear, but if you're going to have a channel enabled to do that, you might as well utilize it. So I did turn those two things on. They did have air mode turned on. I turn it off and then have it in my mode selections. When I fly in acro mode, I have my mode switch set up to do that. Turn on air mode. So one thing I probably will try, I'm curious as to why they left the PID loop frequency at 4 and then D-shot set to 300. It's almost like they were thinking about turning on RPM filtering. So maybe later on I'll try this at 8K and this at 600. If you look at the CPU utilization, and when I went to the CLI and did tasks, it's not, it should theoretically run easily at 8K and D-shot 600 without RPM filtering enabled. So that was a little curiosity on my part. So the big thing though is going into the power and battery tab here, and I changed the maximum cell voltage to 4.4, so when you're charging at high volts, it doesn't think that it's a 2S battery that is below voltage. And I was getting warnings on takeoff, and I'll show that here. So you definitely need to crank this up to 4.4. And even with the new connector, you do get a little bit of voltage sag. So the minimum cell voltage, I turned that down to 3.2 and the warning cell voltage to 3.3. And after I started getting the warning cell voltage, it popped right back up to about 3.6 something. So these are probably good values also to use, but a must is to increase the max cell voltage to 4.4, 4.5. 4.4 is fine. I did play around a little bit with my own settings, which I had set for profile 2, which is really the defaults with the master multiplier set up to 1.1. And then also I turned off G-min, and it seemed to fly a little smoother and not as twitchy. And so I tended to like this setting a little better for my type of flying. But if you wanted to use that, it's real simple. Just go to profile 2, turn off D-min, and set the master multiplier to 1.1 if you want to try that. And that's no harm, no foul, because you can always go back to profile 1, which is what the factory settings were. I wouldn't mess with the filter settings. Look like they spent some time there. And these are just my rates. So I changed them from the factory settings. As far as anything else, I left that pretty much alone. It was already set up for AET R1234, and then this is just how I set up my modes in general. So I did modify that, but they were set up fine for a new pilot. These are just the way I always set up my modes. Another thing that will happen with this quad over time is the camera mount will loosen up after you have a few crashes. So there is a little screw to tighten up the camera within the canopy. It's sitting right here. I'll show you a zoomed in view. You just use a little screwdriver and insert it from the back of the frame and lightly tighten it up. Don't use much torque at all, but just enough to snug it up, and then that helps out the video feed. So I would suggest that. So if you're curious on how to unlock the VTX channels that are locked out, all you need to do is hold down this button here on the VTX board, while you plug in battery. So you have to hold that down first, plug in a battery, and then keep it depressed for about 8 seconds or so. It says 5 seconds, but just hold it down for 8 seconds approximately, and then release it and unplug it, and then it'll be unlocked. You'll know whether or not it's unlocked or not if you select a channel that had been previously locked out. You should be able to see through your goggles with it unlocked. So a final tip, I went ahead and used a tie wrap to hold the VTX antenna up from getting caught in the props. I didn't have that to start with, and it literally fell down into the slot further and got sucked into one of the props. I added some additional shrink tubing because it kind of dinged up the shrink tubing that was on the VTX antenna as shipped. So just to protect it some more because it had a little exposed area there. But yeah, it adds a little bit of weight, but it serves two purposes. One is it keeps it out of the props, and then plus it puts it above the top of the canopy, and so you should get a little better VTX reception with it in that position as well. So here are my thoughts on the Emax Nanohawk. The pros: Emax is very good about coming out with unique quad designs, and I greatly appreciate that. And the Nanohawk is no exception to that. They were thinking outside the box, and I think that's how innovation occurs. Instead of just picking a Whoop frame and putting some electronics on it, they actually, created something with a really lightweight carbon fiber frame, a nano quad. That really isn't a Whoop, but it is something that is kind of in the same class as a Whoop, but it just has prop guards. And because of that, there's some advantages. Obviously, one being there's no yaw washout if you're doing acrobatic moves outdoors, which is definitely a pro. So another thing that's a pro on this thing is the weight. It comes in at 20 grams, what I was measuring. They spec it at 19.5. I think the Mobula 6 is 19 grams, so it's right in the same class as the lightest weight nano quads out there that are Whoops. So kudos to Emax on being able to create something with a carbon fiber frame that's that light of weight. Also, the flight times I thought were really good. I was getting 3 minutes 45 seconds indoors, and that's flying pretty hard. So the flight times with the 300 milliamp hour battery that they provide is definitely on the upper end of these faster Whoops. I think with the right props, it is also one of the faster quads I have. Another pro is that it will actually fly outdoors in winds that are like 5 to 7 miles an hour, and something that you probably wouldn't enjoy flying a Whoop in. Because these are prop guards, and again, not ducks, it has a lot easier time at managing light breezes or light winds. So that's a definite pro. Also, it's a great outdoor acro flyer. Like I said earlier, it is not prone to yaw washouts, which is definitely a pro. I do like the frame. It might look like the prop guards are fairly fragile, and they actually aren't. They can take a hit pretty good. The downfall, of course, is they'll run into the props themselves. But that's not really the point. Outdoors, what I found is I could still hit scraggle and bounce off scraggle. So I still think these prop guards have value outdoors and even indoors, hitting walls. It allows you to bounce off versus digging into the wall is what I found. So another pro is that the SPI receiver has actually pretty good range. I was getting to the outside of my property, which is, the distance that my better quads, as far as nano quads can reach. So this one actually did fairly well as far as the receiver range. And we'll talk about the VTX here in a little bit. The next Pro, I think, it's a good value for the money at $99. So it's coming in at a price point that's very competitive. So let's go over the cons. The first being the VTX is very finicky. If you're on the wrong channel, I don't know if it's Wi-Fi interference, but I found it to be had pretty bad breakup. But if you pick the right channel, like race band channel 8, higher up in the frequency, or the Fat Shark channel 8, you got a lot better reception. The Fat Shark 1, I use that as a default, and it was breaking up pretty bad even indoors, but the minute you kind of see the breakup in the video, the minute I went to a higher band channel, it started doing fine. So if you're experiencing some breakup, try a higher band frequency. And shout out to Nick Burns. I remember him on one of his videos mentioning that. So that is something I would definitely do if you're having video breakup problems like what I was having. The other con is there's obviously no camera angle adjustment, which is unfortunate. I'm not particularly a big fan of the Nano 3 camera. As far as when you're flying into the sun or quickly transitioning, you get a flare out as you're turning around into a window. As far as sunlight, you get washout, and then it'll adjust. The other con is it has a lot of jello, and you can kind of mitigate that again by tightening up the screw here. That helps a little bit, but you never completely get rid of the jello. And I think it might be the lens on this. I noticed that I think Kebab in FPV Cycle, they have a different version of this that just has a different lens, and it seems to be a little better as far as not having as much jello. So there might be some other things, maybe using some hot glue to stiffen this up. It isn't really moving much now that I tightened up the screw here, so I'm not sure if you could totally eliminate the jello that this thing has outdoors. Indoors, you don't see anything, so and this is mostly an indoor flyer, so that's kind of a niggle. Let's see. The other thing I thought was a con was the stock props, and I definitely think anything's better than those. I think these Venom V2 props are great. They give you longer flight time, so I would recommend those. Also, I didn't like the specialized battery. It did outperform the other GNB batteries that I got off of Amazon that are, the standard longer form factor. They're good batteries, they're just expensive. So that's a con, is just the price of the batteries for this thing. And then the last thing, I do not like the connector. The GNB 27 connector I don't think is good as the Beta FPV BT 2.0 connector. I can kind of see why they used it. It's probably a little cheaper to manufacture. Yes, you don't get as much voltage sag. The big con with it is just real hard to unplug things. I'm afraid eventually I might end up pulling back the shrink tubing here, and I don't know, it's just kind of fiddly to plug the battery in and out on this thing. So to me, that's a con. Is this a quad I would recommend? I would definitely say yes. If you're looking for a nano quad that's kind of out of the box, not a whoop, but is below 225 grams, and this one's coming in right at 20 grams, which is incredible. It kind of is defined kind of there's not too many quads that I know of that are not a whoop, that with prop guards that are under 20 or under 25 grams. This comes in at 20 grams, which is pretty amazing with a carbon fiber frame. So from that, I think it's a definite yes on this. So with that, I think it definitely is a keeper. And lastly, it does good outdoors. I think it does better outdoors than a normal Whoop would be able to handle. As far as when little slight breezes, it handles it fine. So with that, wanted to wish everybody a happy new year. And thanks for watching my channel this past year.